In the summer of 1912, on a white caliche ridge outside Lampasas, Texas, a widow named Mattie Vale walked into a field with a flour sack full of beans. And every man at the fence started laughing, not smiling, not whispering, laughing hard enough that one of them had to wipe his eyes with the back of his hand. Because Mattie was not planting in bottomland. She was not planting in Black River soil. She was kneeling on 17 acres of pale, cracked rock the county tax assessor had marked as brush pasture, and she was pressing tiny desert beans into soil so hard a plow point sparked when it hit stone. Her neighbors called that ridge the chalk grave. Nothing stayed alive there long. Cotton burned up by July. Corn curled before it reached a man's knee. Even Johnson grass came up thin and mean. But Mattie Vale was not planting cotton. She was not planting corn. She was planting Tepary beans, 16 pounds of them, small as shirt buttons, dull brown, ugly enough that one farmer said they looked like sweepings from a feed store floor. And if you think the laughing stopped after the first row went in, then you have never seen a hungry county watch a widow bet everything on something nobody understands. Mattie Vale had not always owned land. For most of her life, she had worked land that belonged to other men. She was born in 1871 in a cedar board house east of Belton, and she learned early that soil could be kind to the owner and cruel to the hands that broke it. By 8, she was picking cotton. By 12, she could read a rain cloud better than she could read a newspaper. By 36, she had buried a husband, paid off a mule, and learned the difference between being poor and being fooled. That was the thing about Mattie. She did not trust what people said about land. She trusted what land did when nobody was bragging over it. After her husband died, most people expected her to sell the 16 acres he had left behind and move in with her sister near Temple. That was the sensible thing. The ridge had almost no shade. The topsoil was thin. White caliche ran under it like a buried plate. In hard rain, water skipped off the slope and disappeared into gullies. In dry months, the ground opened in little seams, like the whole hill was clenching its teeth. But Mattie saw something different. She noticed that the low places never turned sour after storms. She noticed the ridge dried fast but not dead. She noticed mesquite roots went deep there, and prickly pear held water even when the grass gave up. And in an old seed bulletin that passed through the Lampasas post office in the winter of 1911, she read one paragraph about a desert bean grown farther west, a bean that could make a crop on almost no rain if the soil drained clean and the seed was not drowned early. The name was Tepary. Mattie copied it in pencil on the back of a grocery receipt. Then she started asking questions. She wrote to a seed house in El Paso. She wrote to a freight clerk in Marfa who had cousins raising dry beans near the border. She wrote to a woman outside Tucson who had sent a note to the same bulletin, saying Teparys would fail in rich wet soil, but hang on in ground that looked useless to people raised on cotton. That line stayed with Mattie. Fail in rich soil, hang on in useless ground. That sounded less like a crop and more like a warning. By February, she had ordered 16 pounds of seed, enough for roughly 1,800 short rows, if she spaced them tight and prayed over every handful. To buy them, she sold her last milk cow. That was when the neighbors stopped merely doubting her and started worrying out loud. A widow with 2 children did not sell a milk cow for an experiment. A sensible woman did not trade milk for dry beans from a place nobody in Lampasas County had ever trusted. Cyrus Penland, who farmed 40 acres of cotton on Good Creek Bottom, leaned on her fence the day the seed sack arrived and said, "That hill won't grow a shadow, Mattie." She tied the sack closed and said, "It doesn't need to grow a shadow." He laughed because he thought she had missed the insult. She had not. In March of 1912, Mattie and her children started opening the ridge by hand. Not with a clean plow, not with hired men. with a grub hoe, a narrow shovel, and an iron bar she used to crack the crust where the soil had sealed over. Her daughter Elsie carried water from the cistern in 2 large tins. Her son Caleb dropped compost by the handful. Compost Mattie had been building for 18 months from ashes, goat manure, spoiled straw, and every peel that left her kitchen. The rows were not pretty. They curved around stone shelves. They broke apart where the caliche rose too high. Some were barely rows at all, just little pockets of amended earth tucked into cracks. And every few days, somebody stopped by to look. A wagon would slow on the county road. A man would call out something about soup beans and graveyards. A boy threw a clod once and shouted that Mattie should plant tombstones instead. She did not answer. She put 1 bean in, covered it, pressed the dirt, moved to the next pocket. 1 bean, 1 breath, 1 refusal at a time. By late April, the first green hooks came through the white ground. They were not impressive, no broad corn leaves, no proud cotton squares. Just small, low vines with dusty green leaves that seemed almost embarrassed to be alive. People took that as proof. "Look at them," Cyrus Penland said at the feed store. "Even the beans know they picked the wrong hill." But Mattie watched those vines closer than anyone watched his cotton. She noticed they did not reach upward like a crop trying to impress the road. They stayed low. They shaded their own roots. When the wind came, they bent and kept their leaves. When the days grew hot, they stopped looking fresh, but they did not die. And that mattered, because the summer of 1912 came in like punishment. By the second week of June, the rain barrels were empty. By July, the Leon River had pulled back from its banks and left cracked mud where boys used to fish. Cotton leaves silvered and folded. Corn stalks rattled in fields that should have been green. Men who had talked big in March stopped talking at the gin. They stood around the scales and did sums in their heads that came out worse every time. A bale they had counted on became half a bale. A feed bill they meant to pay in September became a debt in July. Families started stretching flour with cornmeal, then cornmeal with less of itself. The county was not starving. Not yet, but hunger had put its hand on the door. And up on the white ridge, Mattie Vale's ugly little beans kept growing. Not beautifully, not like a miracle. That would make the story too easy. Some plants failed on the west slope where the afternoon heat hit hardest. Some were chewed down by rabbits before Caleb learned to set brush along the edges. Some flowers dropped without potting at all. Mattie lost nearly a quarter of the stand before midsummer. But the rest held. Because the caliche that ruined cotton had kept the bean roots from sitting wet in spring. The cracked stone that broke plow points gave the roots tiny channels to search downward. The thin soil that looked empty did not feed weeds fast enough to choke the crop. The hill was not generous. It was selective, and Mattie had finally planted something that understood the rules. In early August, Elsie found the first pods. She had gone out before breakfast with a tin cup of water and came back running so fast the cup was empty when she reached the porch. "Mama," she said breathless, "they made." Mattie followed her into the rows. The pods were small, narrow, easy to miss unless you knew where to look. They hung close under the leaves, not showing off, not asking permission. Mattie crouched, lifted 1 vine and saw them tucked everywhere. Dozens at first, then hundreds, then so many that Caleb stopped counting. She did not cheer. She did not wave anyone over. She simply sat back on her heels in the hot dust and covered her face with both hands. For 4 minutes, her children thought she was crying because the crop had failed. Then she lowered her hands and started laughing. Not at the neighbors, not at Cyrus, not at the men who had called her ridge a grave. She laughed because the ground had finally answered in a language everyone else would have to understand. The first picking filled 2 flour sacks. The second filled 5. By the end of August, Mattie had beans drying on sheets, beans in wash tubs, beans spread on the porch, beans hanging in small sacks from rafters where air could move around them. The harvest did not arrive like cotton. All money and pressure at once. It came in waves. Pick, dry, shell, pick again. Every few days, the vines gave more. Every week, the ridge looked a little less foolish, and every week, the road past Mattie's fence grew quieter. Because people who had laughed in March were now measuring their own empty pantries in silence. By September, Cyrus Penland came to her gate. He did not bring a joke with him. He brought a wagon. His cotton field had burned down to sticks. His youngest boy had fever. His wife had been cutting biscuits thinner for 2 weeks. Cyrus stood at the gate with his hat in both hands and looked past Mattie at the ridge he had mocked. "I came to ask what you'd take for a bushel," he said. Mattie looked at him for a long second. Then she opened the gate. She did not make him apologize. She did not remind him what he had said. That would have been easy, maybe even satisfying. But Mattie Vale had spent too many years close to hunger to use food as a courtroom. She walked him to the shed and measured out 1 bushel, then another. Then she told Caleb to load a third. Cyrus said, "I can't pay for 3. Mattie said, "Then pay for 1. By dusk, 2 more families had come. By the next morning, 5. Word moved through Lampasas County the way need always moves. Quietly at first, then all at once. A widow on the chalk ridge had beans. Not enough to make anyone rich. Enough to keep pots boiling. Enough to trade for salt pork. Enough to send a child to bed with something warm inside him. Mattie sold some at a fair price. She traded some for lamp oil, flour, and a half-barrel of cracked corn. And when a family had nothing worth trading, she filled a sack anyway. The ridge everybody called useless became the place people walked toward when useful land failed them. In October, the county agent rode out to see it for himself. His name was Albert Rusk, and he carried a notebook stiff enough to make any farmer nervous. He had written the ridge off the year before as unsuitable for dependable cultivation. Those were the words, unsuitable for dependable cultivation. Mattie remembered them because she had folded the notice and used it to level a table leg. Rusk walked the rows without saying much. He scraped the soil with his boot. He broke a dry clod in his palm. He asked how many pounds she had planted. 16. How many acres? 17, though not all of it took. How many pounds harvested so far? Mattie did not know exactly. Caleb ran inside and came back with the tally marks they had kept on the pantry wall. Russ counted them twice. Then he looked over the ridge, at the low brown vines still holding pods in a year that had punished almost everything else. And for the first time since he arrived, the county agent removed his hat. His report that winter did not call the ridge a miracle. It called it a marginal dryland site, suited to drought-resisting legumes, under careful hand cultivation. That was government language, careful, hard to love. But in Lampasas County, people knew what it meant. It meant Mattie had been right. It meant the land had not been worthless. It meant the official measure had been asking the wrong question. By the next spring, small sacks of Tepary seed moved from Mattie's shed to 12 other farms. Not as a replacement for cotton, not as a cure for poverty, as insurance, as humility, as proof that a farm did not have to imitate better land in order to matter. Mattie never turned the ridge into a grand operation. She did not become a rich woman. That is another kind of story, and it is not this one. But by 1916, she had paid the tax debt that nearly cost her the place. By 1918, she had a smokehouse with a straight roof, 2 milk goats, and a seed ledger wrapped in oilcloth. By 1920, men who once laughed at the fence were coming by in February, asking how deep to plant and how far apart to space the rows. Mattie would tell them, not proudly, not coldly, just plainly, "Don't ask that ground to be creek bottom," she would say. "It'll only disappoint you." Ask what it's been saving itself for. That was the lesson hidden in those 17 acres. The land was not bad because cotton hated it. The land was not empty because corn could not flatter it. The ridge had a language of its own. Fast drainage, hard pan, heat, deep cracks, low weeds, small mercy. To most people, those things looked like failure. To Mattie Vale, they were instructions, and when the dry year came, the instruction became food. That is why the people of Lampasas remembered the White Ridge longer than they remembered the drought. Not because it saved everyone. No single field does that. They remembered it because it changed what they believed about useless things, about land, about widows, about small ugly seeds that do not look like much in the palm of a hand. Mattie Vale planted beans where men told her nothing could grow. And when hunger came down the road, the chalk grave fed the county.